Hey Vasi, you're a photographer, right?
I'm not sure if I would call myself a photographer, but I'm definitely a hobbyist photographer. So I wouldn't give myself that much credit, but I definitely love as what I would call a hobby or sort of a part-time side job to take photos. I love the medium of photography. It's something that I sort of stumbled into probably over 10 years ago, and since then I've really built a bit of a side gig for it, and it's one of the things that goes hand in hand with my love of travel. Period.
Because I've seen your work and I have to say it's amazing. It's like I would consider you a professional photographer. How did you get into it?
Yeah, I know that's a really it's a funny story because I am completely self-taught. So I'm not sure if I come from a naturally creative family. But about 10 or 11 years ago, I had picked up one of those digital Canon cameras and I started taking photos of my travels. And then I started noticing that people increasingly liked my eye for photography and really enjoyed the content that I was developing. And so, because I love to travel so much, that the photography went hand in hand with wherever place or country that I went to. And so, over time, I just started to develop sort of my own technique and aesthetic, because that's ultimately what you develop through photography. You're known for certain photographs. And I think for me, the two things that I've really kind of known for or my aesthetic is I have a very clean composition or eye for how I frame photos. And I really like to focus on the people and sort of the cultures in which the countries that I travel to. And so since then, I've just been able to kind of develop my own techniques. I've graduated through various different cameras, and I moved on to DSLR and added lenses in that. And then so when you and I were talking about this podcast and what some of the guests that we could have on there, I kept thinking photography is such a great one because finally in 2015 I was able to take a photography workshop with National Geographic, and I went to Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I spent about 5 days there as part of this amazing workshop and the person that ran the workshop on behalf of National Geographic was a woman named Nevada Wier. And her career has been unbelievable. She started originally sort of in the outdoors as a guide. I think it was a whitewater rafting. And kind of like me, she is very self taught and started originally in film and graduated to digital. And what she does now is she documents cultures and some of the most remote, interesting people, tribes, cities, areas of the world. And when you see her work, it's just beautiful. It really captures a sense of the spirit and the places in which she photographs. And for me, after I did this workshop, it was really eye opening because I really felt the work that she did is kind of the work that I want to do long
No,
term as
that's
well.
awesome. And ever since you mentioned about it, I've started following her on Instagram, and I have to admit, some of the stories she's able to tell with her images is absolutely fantastic, and I look forward to her work, and hopefully our listeners get to enjoy the interview as well. But before we move on, I would suggest all of our listeners to visit Vasie's website. Like I said, it's absolutely incredible. It's travelmyworld300.com. There's a link to her website through our website as well, which is ftrof.com. And before we get into the interview with Nevada Vasie, is there an image that you're really proud of and that you feel that that's really captured the essence of what kind of story you want to tell?
I think I have two sort of not specific photos, but sort of two themes that I'm very proud of over the last few years that I photographed. I really love portraits and portraiture, and I love people's faces. And I have amassed quite a collection of very sort of unique faces of people in my travels. And those I'm very proud of. I submitted them earlier this year into a lens culture competition. And there was probably 5 or 6 of them. And some of them are just, either young faces, older faces, but all of them really paint a very unique portrait of that person. So that's one. The second for me actually was the work I did at the Santa Fe workshop when I met Nevada. I feel like I really learned a lot, and I was able to really capture the intimacy of the kind of rancher cowboy life there. And I have a couple of very solid portraits of cowboys that we went onto a ranch and photographed, and also a photo of a horse's mouth. That when I really look at the detail of that, again, for me, photography is all about the intimacy of the shot and of that story and of that person. And I felt like those collection of photos from Santa Fe also really demonstrated that sense of intimacy.
So if we were to talk about the future of, keeping in mind the theme of our podcast, how does photography fits in? What is it about photography that makes you think about its future?
I think for photography, when you look at the future state of the world, no matter what the technology will be, I believe it's really about personal stories and being able to convey that through a very visual medium. So I'm of the belief, like, whether it's a smartphone, whether it's, some crazy technologically developed camera, it could be, we transition from this idea of photos just to another medium of videos. I feel like it doesn't matter where we end up technologically. It will always be about the personal stories of humanity and of people. And I don't think that will ever change. Well, thank you, Nevada, for joining us today on our podcast, which will focus on the future of photography. We know you have extensive experience in this field. I, as a sort of hobbyist photographer, really enjoy following all of your work and feel that today you can bring a lot of great insight in terms of where you really feel the future of photography is heading.
And if you don't mind, if you can just start off, because I know you've been in this field for such a long time, can you talk a little bit about the evolution of photography and what you've seen over the past, let's say, 20 years and where it is today?
Well, I think I can probably speak to more than 20 years. I started out with a view camera in a black and white darkroom. Wow. And then, of course, went to cameras with film. And black and white was, really quite miraculous for me, because working in the darkroom and the alchemy and it really is magic. But I became fascinated by color, and so started working with transparency film. And of course, that was the medium for magazines at that time. And I was really, I was committed to working professionally. And then, of course, I transitioned into digital, and I did quite early. In fact, I had the first digital Kodak 1 megabyte camera. So it was something that I knew was going to become very, very important. So it's been fascinating watching, this whole evolution of photography.
And when would that transition would have been, when you went from film to digital? And you sound like you would have been a trailblazer in this area, but did you find other photographers make that transition easily?
I don't remember when I got that first little digital camera from Kodak, but I kept up with it, and I made the transition 100% in 2004 when I felt that the cameras the digital camera I was working with was better than the film camera I was working with. And so I went completely 100% digital. And many of my colleagues at that point went kicking and screaming. I discovered I actually have a techie mind. So the technology I found fascinating, where many people I knew found it really irritating and
So what was
confusing.
your experience like as a film, like you mentioned, the transition from film to digital? What was your experience? What kind of differences did you see?
Well, film, you have to be so exact with film. Actually, it's the best way for people to really understand exposures and understand dynamic range, how much light and dark in an image. Because if you weren't exact, your image was too light or too dark. So it's a really good learning mechanism for understanding, because there's such a difference between how we visually see and how we pay attention to what we're interested in than how a camera does or a lens. And that hasn't changed that much in terms of SLR and mirrorless cameras. iPhone is a whole nother subject. So working with film was fantastic, but digital, because you can work with what's called a raw image with complete data, it means that you have so much more opportunity for fine tuning an image. And if you're really a maven, a virtuoso of seeing, you understand you have to start with a fantastic image and potential. But then you can fine tune it in ways that was not possible with film. So I love digital. It still has limitations, which I find fascinating too. But digital to me was a big breakthrough in the final image.
Right, because with film, I feel that it's something that you either get that precise photo or you don't. And so do you think with digital, it sort of at least provides people, like in your case, I mean, you're a professional photographer, but provides even the general public who want to take photos to be sort of better photographers in the field?
Well, it really broadened the definition to what is photography. I mean, even when there was film, there were people making collages and doing unique, concepts in the darkroom and so forth. But working digitally, it meant that you could completely create images out of digital pieces. And so it broadened the concept of fine art. It broadened, even digital printing, because to make a really good print out of film was very difficult. Plus the way they were doing it was not that fantastic, particularly for color. And so, the digital has just broadened the whole concept and creativity and innovation in ways that was not possible with film.
That transition between film to digital, with film, you really had to focus on getting that exact perfect shot. And there was no real give in terms of mistakes, and I guess not even the sense of editing. So with the advent of digital, do you feel that it's helped allow photography to become more embraced in the mainstream and really let us become, much better photographers in the process?
Well, it certainly has broadened the whole range of what you can do with photography, and not just in the actual capture, but also in the printing and other expressions, because you can, work with scanners now. You can do collages in ways that you couldn't do before. You can do manipulation in ways you can do before. I work in the very traditional field of photographing what I see and trying to interpret it in a creative way, because you can't photograph exactly what you see. You're always interpreting, no matter what camera you're working with. But definitely, being able to process, and I don't manipulate by changing aspects, but just processing and bringing out more detail and doing, some burning and dodgings to make it have more depth and have more character. It's certainly so much more than film, and I really enjoy it. But of course, it takes a lot more time with film. You just photograph, you had it processed, and sent it off to the magazine.
Right. And so now we're sort of in this digital space. In 2010, this crazy app called Instagram starts to become super popular. And then all of a sudden, people over the last 10 years keep posting and using Instagram as the app of what I would say, I guess, photography. And what we've noticed is this sort of switch between a lot of people, and probably you'll in your industry, using those sort of what we call the DSLR cameras, and a lot of people switching to iPhones or whatever sort of handheld phone device to take those types of pictures. What has that transition sort of done for you and kind of the industry?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, between the iPhone and the way that you can put your work out, your art out to the public has certainly changed. I mean, when I was working, basically there was the Great Barrier Reef of the photo editor, and you didn't work for National Geographic or any magazine. You didn't get published, you didn't get seen unless they sort of said, yes, you pass and you can work for our magazine. Now magazines are not that critical anymore. And there are superstars on the internet in all art forms, not just photography, certainly music. And Instagram has changed it quite a bit. I have friends, not so much myself, but I have friends who are getting assignments and, have millions of followers, and it's really important. I think it's changing a little bit with Instagram. Again, I'm not sure it's going to be the platform. In fact, I don't think it will be the platform of the future, but don't ask me what it'll be because I have no idea. It certainly has made a huge impact.
It really has. And do you think an app like Instagram sort of diminishes the work that you do?
No, I don't think it diminishes it. It just changes the way you promote yourself. And I mean, it can just sap you. You can just go into this, a world of social media, and unless you have a plan. But if you want to make a name for yourself as a photographer, if that's what we're talking about, versus the casual user, you have to be very careful how you use your time with social media because, as you know, it's a big black hole. Right. And you can get so caught up in the likes, and you can get so caught up in all these things. And you have to decide what's personally best for yourself. And of course, how is it going to serve you as a professional? For the casual user, I mean, Instagram is used in so many different ways. It certainly has changed the nature of photography because everybody is a photographer now. I mean, pretty much everybody in the world. And that says a lot because I go to some very remote places. People have phones and everybody's photographing. And in fact, this is interesting because I was recently in this market in India, in this very remote area in Chhattisgarh. And there were these tribal people who, of course, I can't speak their language, but we're doing the best we can non-verbally. And they were absolutely fine with me photographing with my iPhone. But as soon as I tried to put up my camera, they were like, no, iPhone only. And that was curious to me, but there's a couple of things that goes on. One is with the iPhone, you're not putting your eye to the camera, but also people can relate to an iPhone and it doesn't seem so quote unquote professional. So I think the world is changing toward photography as photographers have to cope with the new world of photography as a business.
So I'm not going to ask you what the next app is going to be, or instead of Instagram, but why do you think Instagram is not going to be the platform for future?
I don't. First of all, when you look at a feed, you're only looking at a few images, right? And now a lot of ads are taking over, so people see even less images than before. There's pushback on spending time online with that app. I really don't know. It's going to be really interesting to me. Kind of depends on who buys it. I mean, as you know, this industry is in such flux. Something else could come up that's a better platform. And who knows, maybe we'll be dealing with a different way of actually even going online with eyeglasses. And I just don't think one can, it's so exciting in many ways. And I think it's impossible to predict.
So when I think about the future of photography, I kind of break it down in three pieces. So the one is the evolution of technology. So whether it's improved coding or how much can we work on lenses, I think we've gotten to a point where there's not a whole lot that could be done. And a lot of the work that the companies are doing is on the coding side. Then there's another piece around the whole profession of photographers. But the third piece that I'm really interested in is, what does it mean for the future of photojournalism? So over the years, how do you see that evolving with the advent of all these Instagram and, people being able to curate their own content, and then the cost of pictures, I'm assuming, has gone down significantly as well?
That's a great question, but I want to come back to one thing you were talking about in terms of the technology. I always thought there wasn't going to be a real revolution in the gear, the cameras, until there was a substitute for glass. Of course, the iPhone, I think, completely changed that. But I still think we're still very much glass dependent. Mm-hmm. And I say when, not if, there's a substitute for glass, because I know there's technologies coming from different areas. But again, that's where I think we're going to see a very big evolution in the technology of cameras. So that's a curious one for me. But coming back to what you're talking about in terms of the profession, it's always been difficult to make a living in photography. And I've always said to, particularly in journalism, I've always said to people that there is no path. You don't just go to school and like law school or whatever and hang out a shingle and get a job. You have to want it really badly. And you can ask other photographers how they did it, but that's not going to make any difference to your path, except for interesting information, because unless you have that capability of discovering your niche and knowing how to do it, and unless you want it really badly, you're not going to make it. And that's, I think, true for almost any art form.
Right. And you're saying that irrespective of sort of technology or new apps, or that it doesn't matter from a professional sort of technological standpoint, you really, in this space of photography, you really want it badly to sort of make it and make it well.
Yes, that's always been true. But of course you have to be able to use the technology well, and you have to be able to differentiate yourself. I mean, it's always been about knowing the craft, being an artist, understanding marketing, and understanding business. That hasn't changed. It's just the way it's happening right now is different. And it used to be, in many ways, I wouldn't say simpler. It was just a narrower venue when I was, at my prime doing assignments, because like I said, I knew it was magazines. I knew it was the editors. It was pretty clear who I had to, put my efforts to. Now it's not quite so clear because there's so many different ways of promoting yourself, but it circles back to the question of how do you make a living at it? And absolutely, I think it's harder. Absolutely. I think it's a great time for, I love the word amateur because it means the love of art. It's a great time for amateur photographers because, people are getting shows, they're getting promoted, but they're not having to worry about having to make a living at it. And for those photographers who want to make a living at it, I really don't have many answers to that question. And journalism, especially current events, especially war photography, shall we say, places in conflicts, have always been for younger photographers, not completely. But there's never been a great payback. And there's even less now because newspapers don't have staff photographers. Magazines not only don't have staff photographers, they don't have budgets anymore. So it's, I think, extremely difficult and troubling for for someone who wants to be a professional photographer, because, photography of all the arts is a very democratic one. Everybody is going to make a great image at some point in their life. The odds are with you. I mean, I can hold a violin for the rest of my life, and I can tell you a song is never coming out. But the professionals are the ones who are consistent and who can, take a topic and go, yeah, I can make consistently interesting, unusual, different images. But, there's just not the budget for.
So to get back to your point about sort of finding a niche within photography, I know you have actually developed or you have a niche called infrared photography. I was wondering if you could explain that or expand upon that a bit more, and maybe talk about what you think maybe some of those niches need to be for photographers if you're looking at the future state of photography.
Yes, I became interested in infrared photography actually when I was still working with film. Unfortunately, I had given up my black and white darkroom by the time I realized there was black and white infrared film. But I actually did work with a very specialized infrared film for transparencies. But I really didn't get heavily involved until about 2007, when I realized that because of digital cameras, you can convert a camera so that right now there's a filter over your sensor that blocks out the infrared light. And there's ways to remove that filter and put another one on that only allows infrared light. Now, infrared light is a very, very large spectrum, but I'm talking about just near infrared light, right next to the visible light spectrum, not far infrared like Silence of the Lamb looking at things in the dark. That's very, very different. But what's wonderful about it is that although I'm photographing what I see, I'm not photographing the light, the way the light is falling on what I see. So it's completely different, and it has a very mystical, metaphysical quality to me because I'm really photographing what I can't see. And that's a little bit outside what you think of in terms of photography. Of course, it's a more complicated in terms of how one chooses what to photograph, because it's about how the infrared light is absorbed and reflected. Also, it depends on, there's different so-called conversions, which depends on how much visible light do you want coming in. So you have a little bit of what's false colors, some working with, like it has some oranges and blues and things like that. And there's actually a lot of different options within working with these converted infrared cameras. And then, of course, one has to understand how to process it, because it really does take more technical know-how in the processing. But I really love it because I'm always trying to push myself to do something different. I'm a very literal photographer. I work primarily with indigenous cultures, and ethnographic, and I like going to pretty remote places. So I always have a camera with me that's for visible light. And then I also carry a second camera that's dedicated just to infrared. And they makes fantastic prints. I love making prints. It brings me back to the reason I got involved in photography, like the darkroom. So I love the art of printmaking. And that's the type of shows I do. So it's very exciting for me because I'm always trying to push it to keep myself creatively engaged.
And do you think that other photographers then, when they're looking at the future state of photography, have to find those types of niches as well?
Yes, I think people always had to find their niche and their desire. But if you want to work professionally, particularly these days, like I have some very close friends who are like at the top of the heap in terms of adventure and climbing and surfing, and there's calls for that and I think you need to find you have to find a niche that the average photographer can't do. Travel photography is too general. just, I mean, it used to be in stock. The most wildly successful stock image was clouds. Well, that's not going to work anymore. And stock imagery, of course, is going 100% royalty free right now. So it's very difficult to make a living in that. But if you find your niche, I have friends who are doing very well in food photography and in architectural photography and, places in photography that amateurs really aren't able to compete with you. And I think that's the key. And also, it's really important to be someone who puts yourself out there. You've always had to. I felt it was really important when I was, at the height of assignments. People wanted to know who I was. I wrote for magazines. I did columns. I still love lectures and teaching, and I think it's really important to be the person in front of people who is behind the camera. And that hasn't changed. And if you want to really work for a particular magazines or other venues, I think you have to find ways to meet the people in person who work in, whatever genre you want. Because people to people contact, I think, is still really critical.
So
Interesting.
How does the future of, just going to go back to photojournalism for a bit. What's the future, in your opinion, for professional photographers or professional photojournalists, especially with the rise of social media and, a lot of people can just take a picture, share their image, citizen journalism. Do you see a place for photojournalism, let's say 5-10 years from now on, or would it still be relevant?
I certainly hope it'll still be relevant because we really need those photographers, out in the trenches, in the place where, tourists don't go. I mean, particularly important journalism. But I'll tell you, because recently, really what we've been talking about is the still photographer. But you have to acknowledge what's increasingly, actually even more important, is still photographers have to understand video. If you look at like the New York Times and venues where you have paid subscriptions, like myself, I pay for subscriptions online. There's a lot of video content. It's not enough to be a still photographer anymore. There's no question that video is increasingly important, whether it's in small under 3-minute sound bites or whether it's in longer productions. That also is going to separate you from the average photographer because that requires very skillful technique and editing. So it's really more than just stills now. Video is really important. And you have to be, in many situations, that one-person band because you can't, in many ways, you can't bring a sound person even though you'd like to. You can't bring a director, even though you'd like to. You have to be able to do all of this yourself. And these are the people who are going to do very well in journalism.
And going forward, what are some of the risks that you perceive to, potential photographers or the profession of photography?
What you mean, physical risks, or what kind?
I would say probably physical risk, right? Especially if you're trying to cover something. Let's say, in a war-torn country and you have, photojournalists risking their lives. Has that changed a little bit, like that perception of risk, given now that, we're a lot more connected, we know where different photographers are? I mean, has that changed somewhat?
It's certainly a more fraughtful, sometimes dangerous world than before. I started out also as a rock climber and in the outdoor world. I was an outward bound instructor. And I learned very quickly the difference between perceived risk and actual risk. And I learned how easy it is to project possibilities of great harm. And as a photographer, traveling, in places I'd never been before, and as a woman, I learned very quickly not to project. I learned to keep my antenna up, to really pay attention to nonverbal signals. And I'm not a magnet for trouble. And I can read people pretty easily. And I think that is getting lost a little bit. And there's a lot of fear. There's always been fear in the world, but I think there's even more. And as a photographer, you have to learn the difference between actual risk and perceived. And there's a huge difference. Now, photographers who, and I am not a war photographer, photographers who are going there, James Notchway and these amazing Tim Page and where they went, we're talking actual risk. They know what they're doing. They've got fixers. They know what's happening. And that's a completely different situation than someone like myself who's going to, the remote areas of China, or, I'm heading off in 2 days to Bangladesh. Those are two separate worlds, but it's understanding people. It's understanding nonverbal signals and not letting projections and what could happen get in the way of what is happening, because curiosity is my best friend. I have to be willing to say, "Ooh, what's happening over there? Oh, wow, I haven't met that person." I try not to project whether someone likes me or doesn't like me. I like to stay, I guess, in that Zen moment of what is happening right now. And if I get a feeling like this is not working, but it's about a feeling. And so I think a lot of photography is personal psychology, is understanding yourself. And you can't lie to yourself, because I know every reason not to photograph. Oh, my feet hurt, I don't have the right lens, or whatever. You have to understand your personal psychology so you can confront the world, very honestly and in a very truthful manner. And I think that's going to vary from individual to individual, and certainly from profession to profession. I mean, photographers who are the premier surfing photographers, they have a different set of skills than someone like myself or someone who's going to Iraq.
So I think sometimes what I'm hearing, I think a lot of times when we talk about future state, we always assume something needs to be completely different, or we have to end up somewhere different. But what I'm gathering from our conversation to you is that regardless of the future, really fundamentally for you, photography is rooted in that sort of humanistic approach. There will always be that sort of personal psychological association with it, and how you take those photos. It doesn't matter what technology we use, but there will always be sort of that human element to it. And I think, is that correct to say that you feel that won't change, whether it's 5, 10, 20 years down the road?
Yes, I completely agree with that. I mean, we are humans still, and we still crave that contact. I mean, I don't agree with a lot of people who feel that there's no human contact on social media. I think there's quite a bit. You just don't want it to be the only way of making contact with people. And we live in such a visual society, and there's so many ways of now seeing things visually, whether it's TV or movies, and of course now the internet, and of course we've talked about Instagram, and who knows what's going to come up next in terms of holograms and more portable devices. I mean, that's where the technology gets interesting. But we still want human-to-human contact, and that's why I think video is so important, because you can get a concept across viscerally through video that is different than a single image, even though I think that has a different type of impact. And also there are ways of showing videos now in shorter sound bites that have great impact. So I just think that, staying true to what interests you in photography, because it's all about passion. It's all about being creative. It's all about knowing how you want to express yourself, because I think everybody has to have art in their life in some form or another. And so, yes, an iPhone can be just a casual so-called snapshot or selfie. But I think many people are using photography in very creative ways on these very small devices, because it's not about the camera. It doesn't matter how big your camera is. It's how you use it and how creative you are. And I always feel when I talk to photographers, I say, look, what you want is a snowflake image. You want an image that you don't think anybody else has ever made. And so I've always felt there's no such thing as a boring subject. There's just really boring ways of photographing it. And so I'm cursed and blessed with amazingly interesting subjects, great people. Like I said, I'm going to Bangladesh, amazing faces. Well, it's not enough to let the subject carry the image. I have to create a very interesting and I think honest image about what I'm seeing. And that's why I find photography very exciting, because I don't think there is an Everest in creativity.
So I just want to follow up on one thing you had mentioned a while ago about one of your experiences where the people that you were, capturing the images, they were more comfortable with an iPhone versus a DSLR or a camera. Do you think that gives a smartphone a slightly greater advantage over a DSLR, that because it doesn't come across as that maybe professional or something that's intimidating, that the subjects open up a little bit more as well, and it kind of allows you to go further when you're trying to capture images or trying to capture a story?
Yes, I think it does. And it comes back to when I still have an SLR camera that has a mirror, which means for the most part, you have to put it up to your eye. I always realized early on that was blocking my interaction. And because I am left eye dominant, which means the camera would really cover my whole face, I learned to not have the camera up to my face and really look at people. And then came mirrorless cameras, which I went to fairly quickly because I could use the flip out screen, which meant that I could still look at people and focus by touch focusing. I love the little Olympus cameras. They're small. And so I personally think the flip out screen was a really big game changer for these bigger cameras. And so that translates to an iPhone. And so an iPhone, I find I can just hold right up next to someone. They don't even notice it whatsoever. Because it is smaller. And that's, of course, why people liked Leicas in the past, because they were small and unassuming as opposed to these super big DSLRs. So yes, but I find that a lot of photographers are too timid and they stand back, and with iPhones, they make the same mistake. It's really, again, about understanding whatever camera you're working with and using it as best you can.
And so that now that the technology, you talked about DSLRs, they've gone mirrorless. What do you think is essentially the next step? I know you talked about really the disruptor in the industry in terms of a photography product would be how we deal with glass. Would you know really what that next step in technology could look like?
I wish I did. That would be brilliant. But cameras are changing. I think mirrorless are really taking over a big part of the market. There's older photographers who really love their SLRs. And I tell you, I do too. The responsiveness of an SLR is really quite remarkable. But the mirrorless cameras are taking a big slice of the market. And I think that will continue. Of course, our phones are becoming more and more amazing. And I find that there are people who are saying, I don't want to carry that big camera anymore. I'm just taking my phone. Particularly, I would say in the amateur market, not so much in the professional. Although I always have my phone, because as they say, the best camera is the one you have with you. And also there are situations that I have gotten into, as I mentioned, where I can't use my camera, but they'll let me use my phone. I've been in that. I was in that situation in Tibet where I could go into a monastery with my phone, but not with my cameras. So I stay up with the technology, with the phones, and I use them interchangeably. So that is going to continue. Now, as far as what happens, the next evolution of cameras, it's up for grabs. I mean, the technology, I think, is all very exciting. And they might even skip over this need for the revolution in glass. I don't know, but I think it's because I love technology and I'm not really a geek. I'm sort of a wannabe geek, but I do love all these advances, and so it's a great way to stay young.
So when we talk about future of things, mostly we assume technological change. But what other forces do you think can have an impact on photography?
What a brilliant question. What other impact do we have about photography? Well, I think we already have, because we talked about the extreme democratizing of photography, where now everyone's photographing. It's also created restraints because of selfies. Like right now, I'm in situations where there's no photography, like particularly in Buddhist areas, because they're afraid of selfies. You're not supposed to turn your back to the Buddha. So they just say no photography. There's more guardrails, like at the Taj Mahal now. You can't go to the edge and look down the river because they're really afraid of people falling over. So selfies, and that's not about cameras. That's about how people use them. Cell phones have really changed. You go to a place to photograph something. I've gotten myself in a really good vantage point waiting for a ceremony, and then suddenly everybody has raised their cell phones to take a video. And of course, I can't fault them, but I just start laughing because it's rather comical. So it's how people are, what are people doing with all these images? Why do we need so many images of ourselves and all the places that we go? And of course, people talk about this impact Instagram has had on, having to have yourself in every place where you are. And so it's how people are using the camera that I think is changing at some people say an alarming rate. Some people find it hysterical. And I'm somewhere in between, but it's this incessant need to put ourselves in images that has taken over.
Well, Nevada, thank you very much for speaking with us today. We typically like to close out our podcast by asking a couple of personal questions. So question number one, do you have a book that you really love and that you would recommend to listeners? And number two, any favorite sort of movie that you like to watch year in and year out, or one that you would actually recommend to our listeners?
Well, I love to read. I've always loved to read. In fact, I love to listen to books. So I kind of read, and then I buy a book, and I also buy the Audible. So I read and listen to books like all day, and I go through about 3 to 5 books a week. So that would be very difficult to say what my favorite books are. I like books, though, I have to say, about imagination. I'm a big fan of science fiction, and and then my second choice are people that can really string amazing words together. Joan Didion, Ann Patchett, this fabulous book, A Gentleman in Moscow. So I kind of go for the imagination ones, or I go for people who have a grasp of language, the written language that I would just dream about for myself.
So I think this is probably a perfect moment to end our conversation. Thank you so much, Nevada. This was very, very fascinating. I'm one of those who, thinks that who's a good photographer is probably not. But but I think that's like most people, right?
Nevada runs great workshops. She'll tell you very bluntly if your work is good or if it's not.
Okay, so maybe I have to attend one of those.
Yeah.
We appreciate your time, Nevada, and I've been. Since Vasie mentioned, I've started following some of your work, and it's been fascinating. So thank you so much.
Yeah. And Nevada, did you also want to tell people where they can follow your work if they're interested on Instagram? I think you are on Facebook, but I know primarily you're active on Instagram.
Yes. And, I'd like to say that I do think photography is hard, and I think it does take time to really understand how to photograph what you see, because again, it's just interpretation. So I think it is hard. And I am active on Instagram. I do love to post my favorite images, and so I hope people will follow me there. And I am on Facebook, but I think it's more limited on Facebook. So I encourage people to follow me on Instagram. And I have a new website that's coming up soon. So please look for that.
Right. What we'll do is we'll post all of that information on our podcast website. Again, thank you very much and happy travels.
That was a fascinating conversation. I think I'm one of those, I always say that photography is one of those professions where everyone thinks that they have an eye for photography, and probably most of us don't.
Yes.
So I put myself in that category.
That is actually true too. I'm very sorry, broad population, but not everyone knows how to take a good photo. That is correct.
Being a photographer, I think everyone thinks that there probably could be a natural at it. It's just funny. But for me, it's interesting because there are a lot of things she talked about that, again, I wouldn't have thought about, and how it kind of fits in with the whole notion of the future of. One of the things that was really fascinating for me, and I'd like to get your point as well, is with the advent of smartphone technology, the trust piece that has developed when you go and take pictures of indigenous population, and she mentioned that how there's a little bit more trust with a smartphone than, let's say, traditional camera because of how it comes across and people being intrusive, whereas a smartphone is more personable and you can get further up close. Has that been your experience as well? That's interesting, right?
Yeah. No, I find, and you're right. And I think what it's done too, and I really liked when she touched upon that is, and maybe that's where, the future state is, there's more of that trust, is that those fancy cameras that photographers use can feel very intrusive and very formal. And I think with iPhones, what we've been able to do in society is to break down that intrusiveness, because everyone has an iPhone, and with an iPhone comes a lens and all of these different sort of apps and buttons that you can take photos. And I really like that point too. I think what that technology has been able to do is to sort of remove that weird barrier between someone like you and I. So you're less likely to say no to me to take a photo with an iPhone, rather than, let's say, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, if I came up to you as this photographer with this huge lens, she's right, that trust piece really emerges more and more as technology becomes more and more, I guess you would say, proliferated or different in the context of photography.
And I think selfie has probably played a big role as well, right? So right now, okay, I see a group, I want to capture this story, I want to take that picture. But while I do that, I can stand up beside them, I can take a selfie with them and just show that I'm just another person just like them. And yeah, I just thought that was also fascinating. And the other thing she touched upon with smartphone was, and I know you were curious about that, is where does this consumption lead us, right? You mentioned you have like 8,000 pictures on your phone. I have somewhere close to 6,000. I don't even see a lot of them.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. And I think the point is that, the more that photography becomes accessible to the masses, like what is that future state? Like how many pictures and do we need? How much do we need to document every aspect of our lives? And I was joking with you that I have 8,000 photos on my iPhone. I can't imagine what someone maybe of a younger generation would have on their phone and the amount of selfies that they took. So I think that point that she makes is, yeah, we've opened this up in terms of photography. It's a lot more accessible to everybody. It's not so much, there are still niche photographers, but every person thinks they can take pictures. But where will that consumption in the future take us? And I think that's an interesting point. It's really hard to answer that. And it really made me think about where photography will end up from a consumption standpoint, maybe even 3-5 years down the road.
I wonder if there's more, I don't know, this some anthropological study. So like something, it's interesting how the purpose of storytelling through photography has sort of evolved over the years, right? Changed a little bit. And I guess that's also one of the forces besides technology that will define what the future of photography looks like, right? So yeah, I mean, this was a fascinating conversation. Thank you for arranging this. And I'm sure our listeners would enjoy this as well. At the end, I just want to say, if you like our episode, please rate us on Apple Podcast or Google Play or wherever you get your fix for podcasts. Please visit our website. It's www.ftrof.com. And if you write a review, ideally a glowing one, but any kind of feedback would be really appreciated. You can also email us. You'll get a chance to enter into a draw, and we'll be sending some gifts your way as a thank you. And I hope you really enjoyed this episode.
See you next time.